Hi, my name is Tony McLaughlin, and I'm talking to Imran Gulamhuseinwala from Open Banking in the UK. Imran, it's great for you to talk to us today. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your role at Open Banking, please.
Tony, lovely to see you today. How are you? So I am the implementation trustee for Open Banking. What that actually means is that I've been appointed by the Competition and Markets Authority to make sure that Open Banking gets built the way they would like it to get built here in the UK. And for your listeners that are not here in the UK, Open Banking is a remedy that has been required of the 9 largest banks here to make sure that they meet their requirements under PSD2 using standard APIs. You're going to ask me lots of follow-up questions about that.
I will ask you lots of follow-up questions on that. So, Open Banking in the UK essentially has started as being, from the bank's perspective, something that they have to comply with. So, have they complied? Are we beyond the compliance phase yet?
It's a really important point. It is a compliance exercise for them. But even when I started out at the very beginning of Open Banking, I was encouraged to think about a framework: comply, compete, innovate. And I was told actually when I started that really it's going to be 95% compliance, and it has been. And they're still not through with the compliance element. There's a few reasons for that. I think firstly, this is actually quite challenging. There's a lot of work that needed to go into developing the standards to make sure that they would work for all stakeholders, not just the banks and the third parties, but obviously for customers as well, to make sure that they were really safe and secure. We also needed to ensure that some central infrastructure got built. And then of course the banks needed to implement all this stuff. And for many of them, they'd never dealt with APIs before. Some of them had never dealt with some of the security implications of APIs, or even with cloud storage and cloud computing. So there's a big learning curve for the banks. 3 years into it, I'm pleased to say, however, that we are approaching the end. I believe that we're about 90% of the way through implementation. So the APIs still aren't finished yet, particularly in the payment space. But we're very close to the end, and we're seeing a lot of activity now of third parties who are looking to build applications on top of Open Banking.
And you mentioned the payment space. Of course, in Open Banking, there are 2 basic services. One is the account information service, and the second is the payment information service, or payment initiation service, I should say. One of the impediments in terms of the uptake of the payment initiation service has been the customer experience. So how close are we to solving that frictionless customer experience in payments?
So I think we're pretty much there. One of the big innovations that we undertook more than a year ago now is we required the banks to build Open Banking, both the data element and the payments element, on mobile. And that means that customers can now initiate bank payments from their mobile phone using biometrics. So no requirement to add in any additional information, compared to a card where you might have to add in the 16-digit card number plus the CVV and expiry date. You don't have to do any of that in Open Banking. Sometimes it's as easy as a swipe or a thumbprint or a facial recognition. So that's an important piece. One of the things that I've found, however, is that whilst the customer experience has improved, other elements also need improving as well. So the bank's APIs, the initial versions of the bank's implementation of the APIs, was just didn't have the kind of performance that seasoned payment professionals like yourself would be accustomed to. So we had too much downtime. Availability was not high enough. Response times were too low. Response times were too long. And what we've done is we've really tightened up on some of those elements. And now we're beginning to see some good uptake. So we're still in the proofing stage. But for example, in the crisis, many people donated to Captain Tom on Just Giving. You might remember that. And actually one of the payment providers offered pay by bank as one of the top options there. And for the first time ever, we have thousands of people using it. And we've got some lovely data now on usage and uptake, what the pinch points are in terms of customer experience and so on. And I think it really allows us to improve upon that.
Yeah. And of course, the UK government is also planning on using payment initiation for collection, for example, of taxes some way down the line. So look, Imran, I mean, it's great to hear that we're getting through the compliance project and we're almost there and things are looking bright in terms of the payment initiation service. I'd like to kind of take a little bit of a step back, because open banking, it seems to me, is almost like an instance of the right of data portability that's enshrined, for example, in GDPR, where in theory people have the ability to say to one organization, please share my data with another organization. But there's a long way to go before that kind of principle is operationalized or brought into effect in the wider economy. So this is a long question, I'm sorry for it, but is open banking a springboard into that more generalized open data economy that might emerge?
I believe it's a springboard and possibly one of the only incidences of data portability and interoperability, and maybe we'll talk about those two components together, of it being executed anywhere in the world. One of the reasons I say that is there is a fascinating report written by Professor Furman of the US for the UK government just under a year ago, where he looked at what is required to bring competition to big tech. And similarly to the architects of GDPR, he and the team also determines that data portability is a really integral part of it. And the only quoted example that kept being used in the report is open banking here in the UK. And maybe if I could just say a word about, well, what do we mean by portability and what do we mean by interoperability? The GDPR, exactly as you say, gives you the citizen the right to port your data from one party to another. But then where GDPR falls down is it doesn't say how it's done.
Exactly.
And frankly, if let's say, no, I was going to say an unscrupulous, firm, but even just a normal firm who, is resource constrained, wants to move your information, they could do it by sending a memory stick in the post.
Exactly. GDPR says machine readable format, but doesn't prescribe the format. So then, if we are to generalize this across the economy, I mean, you've had a multi-year mission encouraging the UK banks to work together on standards and implement a way of sharing that data in a secure manner. Does that then suppose that across other industries, they need to have similar governance structures and potentially a similar, if you like, regulatory push to open up that data?
I believe that's right. I think that there's now, as a result of the maturity of the debate, there's a real acceptance now, actually, of a new term, at least in government, which they call data mobility. So mobility is different from portability in two key respects. One is that it is real time, and the other is that it is using standards, so interoperable. But it's very hard to determine that an industry or a sector should actually just kind of magic up standards and make them interoperable. And I think the big learning that we've had here in the UK is that there is real merit in having this central entity to play the role of facilitator, coordinator, and where required, enforcer, to make sure that that all happens. In some markets, that can be a role that's played by a scheme. Sometimes a scheme isn't appropriate or isn't commercially viable. But one of the things that we are seeing is that open banking in Europe seems to be held back by the lack of any of these kind of central entities. So a central entity or an implementation entity, I think, is an important part to making this happen. and certainly being actively considered for things like open finance.
And what's your, vision of the benefits that would accrue to a modern economy if we achieved that vision of data mobility, which is a concept that goes beyond, if you like, hypothetical portability, which we've got now in GDPR. So what are the benefits of achieving that?
I think the benefits are greater competition, innovation, and really end consumers who choose to kind of it gives them the option to take control of their data in a way that just doesn't exist at the moment. So how can it result in better competition? Well, very simply, it allows you to market yourself for better deals and services. And
Yes.
it's very obvious in the utility sectors how it might work. How much water do you use? How many FX transactions do you make? How many car crashes or dinks have you had? And you share that information by taking it back from the incumbent who you've currently got a relationship with, and then share it out to other parties. And essentially they bid for that information.
Yes. Okay. A market developing where the consumer is more in charge of more in charge of their information, and also potentially can monetize their information.
I think that's the crucial thing. And the term that I picked up early from one of the architects of open banking is that they said, what we're trying to do is rebalance the market in favor of consumers. And if you think about it, what happens to our data currently if we're not playing that role of taking it and porting it or making it mobile, is that very often is that the corporate that we're dealing with, the firm we're dealing with, is using that data and harvesting it for their benefit rather than your benefit. And maybe their benefit is as simple as selling it, or maybe it's about trying to sell things to you or persuade you to do things in slightly different ways. And it means that your interests aren't really aligned with them.
So I'm wondering about the conditions that need to be in place for this open data, this data portability, mobility concept to come into being. I mean, one underpinning it would seem to me, and I'll just give a small list, you tell me what you agree and disagree with, but there needs to be a strong privacy legislation in place to make sure that data subjects have got rights over their own data. That seems to be number one. Second is that you need to be able to give a good consent to sharing that data in a secure manner. And that speaks to maybe some form of digital identity and certainly standards. And the next one, which may be the more controversial topic, is, can we create incentives where the other players, I mean, the banks had to be, if you like, compelled to do open banking in the UK.
Yeah.
But can we get to a point where the players see the commercial benefits in opening up these APIs, which may enable them to, for example, plug their services into other platforms?
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic as to what are the right conditions, or what conditions need to be in place. I completely agree with you that the data rights of citizens need to be enshrined in some sort of legislation.
Yes.
Interestingly, I'm not sure I'd agree with you, Tony, that it has to be privacy related. I'm increasingly thinking that privacy and data rights are two different things.
Okay.
And interestingly, I think that my data rights could potentially erode your privacy. You have, just as a sidebar point on that, is that if I take a photo of the two of us standing by the Eiffel Tower and I post it on Facebook, I've exercised my right to do that, but have I infringed on your privacy?
Interesting.
Or do you have a right to tell me that I can't do that? The only reason I mention the Eiffel Tower is because actually the French government can stop you publishing photos of the Eiffel Tower, which is maybe something you can Google afterwards.
I see. Interesting.
But we have it in open banking through something called silent parties, which is if I send money to you and you appear on my bank statement, and then I share that bank statement with a third party, it's got your name on it. Is that an
Interesting.
infringement of your privacy or otherwise? So I do.
Because there's no consent from that party to that data having been shared.
Correct. Well, the question is whose data is it? Is it yours? The fact that you're on my statement, is it yours or vice versa?
Yeah, interesting.
GDPR is actually quite clear on that. Certain categories of data I can share regardless of having your consent or otherwise. But I just mention it because it's a really interesting area to tread very carefully, not least of which because the unintended consequences of dealing with it. And privacy is one of those things.
So you're making some fine distinctions here between mobility and portability and privacy and data protection. I like it. I like these fine distinctions that you're making.
Well, I think, you know, as we march towards a data economy, everyone's going to have to get a lot better at using these terms with you know, real specificity.
Yes, absolutely.
Because otherwise you end up caught in a loop where all privacy is good. The more privacy, the better. But there is a flip side to it.
And as you say, we're marching towards this data economy. Now, it's not clear to me that a more digital economy is more inclusive, more equal opportunities, or less vulnerable than the economy that we've come from. So how does your vision of this open data economy make things better?
I think you almost need to think about it in two ways. One is when things are all working well, and then when things are not working well. I think the data economy element has a very important role to play when things are working well in reducing friction in the overall economy. You touched on digital identity. I didn't not reference it because I don't think it's important. I think it's absolutely crucial. And I think it's crucial that we increasingly have a grown-up debate about what digital identity means. And I think we need to recognize that there are different flavors of digital identity, starting from I'd just like to prove that I'm over the age of XYZ, but I don't want you to know anything about me, all the way to here's a full digital identity that you can use to KYC me, or indeed I can get married and pay my taxes with. And there's an enormous spectrum there, and where we want to sit on there is up to us. But if we get that right, then we can unleash a huge amount of unnecessary work, duplication, fraud in the current system, and that will have tremendous benefits. So I think I was going to say that's when the world's working well. When the world's working not so well, and we're seeing this now, is that resilience.
Yes.
How do we make ourselves more resilient? Not just by wearing face masks and socially distancing, but how do we become more resilient in our economy as individuals, from our mental health? And there, again, I do think that aspects of the things that we've been talking about are really important, so that you've got the information at your fingertips, so that you're a small business owner, you can monitor your cash position carefully. You can apply for credit very quickly from the government more quickly. A lot of the COVID financing would have been hugely made, the transmission mechanism for a lot of the COVID financing would have been hugely improved if open banking had just been a year earlier. It could have really helped lots of things in that area. And one thing I should say, Tony, is there's an entity called GovCo, which is essentially an economic observatory, which is pulling in real-time information through open banking with the full, consent of the underlying subjects. And up in Edinburgh is pulling all this information together to show real-time how the economy is moving. Job losses, pay reductions, furlough coming in, accounts receivables, late payments. So enabling government to stop, making really fine-tuned, real-time amendments to the economy to try and manage it better.
Well, I guess the promise of the open data economy and more digital economy, it reminds me of a very early quote from Bill Gates. He said the reason why he loved his laptop so much, he was comparing it to a briefcase. He can keep putting more stuff into his laptop and it doesn't get any heavier.
Yeah.
And in a sense, the digital economy is the same. It's not just about removing inefficiencies, but we can keep putting more and more economic activity into the digital space, and it doesn't get any heavier, meaning, carbon footprint, for example. So it's a massive realm for developing new business models. But I want to end, by asking you on some of your reflections as we've gone through this phase. Open banking was one of the hot topics in finance in the past couple of years, along with the application of DLT and machine learning and artificial intelligence. And then comes along, the virus that brings us back down to earth. So, what's your reflection on what comes next, based upon your experiences during lockdown?
Well, I think from open banking's perspective, lockdown has been a storm that has been weathered. The teams that are putting it all together are one of the lucky, fortunate members of the workforce that can work from home.
Of course.
It's interesting. One of my takeaways is how reliant the UK banks are on technical resource in India.
Yes.
We watched the lockdown not just here but also in India, but one of the most uplifting things from the pandemic for open banking is of the 300 or so regulated entities that are all building propositions on the open banking ecosystem. The moment this happened, there was no shortage of ideas as to how they could try and help businesses in difficulty, help government with getting the economic stimuluses out, help individuals prove their identity or prove their sort code and account number so they could benefit from universal credit. There was such an enormous forthcoming of these ideas. The problem was that we couldn't get them integrated into the whole economy quickly enough. Government wasn't ready to absorb them. Banks weren't ready to absorb them. But I do think that actually, open banking will fast become part of the furniture, and then have a role to play in resilience when, unfortunately, we may well have further lockdowns like this to come.
Absolutely. And any personal reflections in terms of lessons learned?
I think it's important to manage your teams tightly during these kind of situations. I think it's increasingly a big topic, thinking about mental welfare. Personally, for me, I'm spending an awful lot of time running. I'm on my third set of trainers already, and I've learned how to garden, which is not something you would have associated me with 6 months ago.
Well, not a digital skill, but I'm sure that you've been tapping into many instructional videos to brush up on your skills there.
Absolutely, and if you ever need courgettes, we've got a lot of courgettes.
That's good to know. Hey, Imran, it's great to hear not only about what you've done in open banking along with the teams in the whole industry, but the vision for what this could lead to. And certainly as we build this more digital economy, which has to become more an opportunity for everyone, not just winner takes all, we'll need great minds like yours to guide the way. So thank you very much for spending time with us today.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.